talked about learning disabilities. You test for autism here or speech and language. When would I know I need to get my kid tested for something like autism? What are the signs I'm looking for as a parent? We talked about with learning disabilities, if they're having a hard time keeping up and that sort of thing, but autism is a little different. So tell me what.
Yeah, autism is its own unique set of behaviors and social skills that you're looking at, right? So kids from 0 to 18 months, there's such a huge range of development that happens, right? So we're not necessarily looking for it at that time. We just want to see that kids are meeting their milestones appropriately. And if they're struggling with expressing their first words right around 6 months to 12 months, or if they're not engaging by looking at you in the eye, or they're not turning their head when you're calling their name, right? Those are red flags and question marks that you want to keep an eye on. But around 18 months, if you're really seeing that they're struggling, or if they've obtained skills and then they have a regression between 18 and 24 months, then those are cues that something may be going on with autism. Okay. So at that point, you'd really want to talk to your pediatrician, right? And ask, they do screeners pretty regularly for autism, but sometimes the more mild cases get missed, right? So other things that you might want to be looking for at that age are just is your child interested in interacting with you, right? So younger kids, they're so interested in patty cake and peekaboo, right? And interacting with their parents, and they're doing social smiles. You're seeing more expressions. You're seeing more gestures like pointing or wanting to show you things that they're excited about, right? So a lot of that interaction, and then also watching their siblings, right, or other kids at the park, right? So if you're seeing some of those things are missing, they're not interested in other kids, they're not showing me things, they're not engaging with me socially, those are red flags, right? Those are things that you want to look out for. Other concerns would be if your child is really rigid, right? So sometimes kids need to do things in a certain way, right? They just really thrive on their routine, but it goes beyond just, I have my bedtime routine, right? This is, I need to do this in a certain way, otherwise I'm going to have a meltdown, right? I had a parent one time that had a toddler, and the toddler liked to stroll a baby in a stroller in a park, but he had to do it in a certain direction, in a certain loop.
Sure.
And if the family wanted to go a different way in the park, he just would have a complete meltdown.
Sure.
Right? So it's that rigidity that we're looking for, and that inflexibility, difficulties with transitions, things like that. Kids that are overly sensitive to sensory input, right? So sometimes it can be tags, that's the classic thing we think of, or genes. Sometimes it's textures of food, right? So things that are overly mushy or sticky, right? They might not like those things. Or sometimes it's an overreaction to sounds, right? Like the blow dryer or a lawnmower. Those things might set them off, whereas for most kids, it's not bothering them, right? So that's another concern. We're also looking at how kids play with their toys, right? And how they engage in play. So when they're between 4 to 5, are they doing a lot of imaginative play? So are they acting like a superhero, or playing with their dolls and pretending that a big imaginative world is happening? Or are they more focused on lining up their toys, or just playing with the wheel on a car, right? So playing with things more functionally rather than in an imaginative way. And again, we're looking at 4 to 5, because you have to remember all of this is a spectrum.
Sure.
In terms of development.
Sure.
Right? And at 4 to 5, we really want to see that imaginative play happen and kind of explode. And if your child is struggling with that and they're still in more functional play, or not wanting to engage in the curiosity of play, then that could be a concern as well.
Okay, so if you're in a big group and there's, 4 or 5 kids playing, and your kid is playing by him or herself and not engaging with the other kids,
yes.
and they're not doing, is that kind of a thing you'd be looking for in a group setting? So
yes.
they're there with the kids, but
right.
they're not playing with the actual kids in their game or whatever.
Right,
okay.
right, at 4 to 5,
sure.
right? Because we remember, in terms of play and child development, kids are playing independently until about age 3, and then they're doing more parallel play, meaning that they're doing the same thing as the kids next to them, but they're not necessarily playing together. Sure. right? So 4 to 5 is when you start to see more of the friendships developing and the interest in like cooperative play. So if you're seeing it at that point, then that could be a concern, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. And we haven't touched on this much, but speech and language. When do I say, okay, I'm a parent and I think, my kid is saying, a word wrong and we're maybe now 5. When they're little, they have their own words for different things, right? But what is the age in which I'm going, I think maybe we're having a problem with speech?
Yeah, so it can start at 3 if they're having like severe difficulties with articulating their words to the point where like you really can't understand what they're saying. They're trying to make sounds, but you just can't clearly understand what they're saying. Sure. That's usually a big red flag, that articulation challenge. Sometimes kids just don't have a lot of expressive language. Like they understand everything you're saying, right? But they can't communicate. Right, and they're relying more on gestures or pointing or other ways to compensate. Okay. So those are concerns, and we're kind of looking at that around age 3, 2 to 3 if it's severe, and then we start testing at age 4 for speech language concerns, but you can really rely on the child find services that you can get through your local school district, and they do assessment, speech and language, OT, PT, to determine if your child would benefit from special education services. So that can be sometimes coming into your home and providing like OT or speech at home. Or if they're like 4 to 5 that preschool age, they can participate in an early childhood education program. That's like a half-day preschool where they get exposure to education, but they also get those therapy supports as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then lastly, you talked a little bit, but do you test individually for like a anxiety disorder, or would that be something that would be usually with something else, or is it a standalone diagnosis? How does the emotional part, what are you looking for testing for there?
Right. So there's what we use the term comorbidities in the field, right? Where you have a learning disability, you're also much more likely to have something else go along with it. Okay. Right. So a lot of times that can be ADHD. But a lot of times it tends to be anxiety or depression, and especially for smart kids, right, who know I'm really smart and this shouldn't be hard for me, but I'm not doing as well as the other kids, right? And it's affecting my self-esteem because I don't know why this is so hard for me, right? Sure. So it's really easy for anxiety to come about. So one of the things you want to look for is if you have a family history of anxiety or depression. It's quite common. The same with ADHD too. If a parent or a grandparent has anxiety or depression, that their child is, almost 50% likely to have a mood disability or a mood disorder as well. Okay. So those are things that we test for. We don't exclusively test for anxiety or depression a lot of times. Usually you can get that treated via therapy, sure, right, going in to see a therapist. But if the anxiety is severely affecting the child's ability to go to school, for example, like if they have severe social anxiety or separation anxiety and they can't partake in the school environment because they're so anxious, then that might be a good time to see a psychologist and get an evaluation.
Okay. And on that same idea, how do we look for kids that we're looking for ADHD? What are the signs for ADHD that we're looking for to say this is enough that I need to talk to somebody and get this kid tested or get some kind of help?
Right, yeah. So usually the type of ADHD that people think about is the hyperactive impulsive type. And there are 3 types of ADHD. So I'll talk about that one first. Yeah. Because that's the type that you tend to see, right? It's most obvious. Sure. These kids are like going 1,000 miles an hour. They have so much energy. They're really fidgety and they like to move. They can be impulsive, right? Sometimes they can interrupt or blurt out. It's hard to sit at dinner with them because they don't want to sit there. They want to be like moving around, or they don't want to watch a movie, right? So if you have a child that just has like so much energy and it's affecting their ability to engage in like group situations, sure, like soccer class or something like that, or, we're talking about school, being able to sit down and like just sit for the morning meeting, or sit and do their math work, right? Then at that point, you might say, this is affecting them, to the point where it's hard for them to make friends because they're so impulsive, right? Or it's hard for them to learn because they're not focused.
Yeah.
Right? So usually, again, it's kindergarten that we like to start testing for that.
Okay.
Because you want to have them in a structured school setting where there are structured expectations.
Yeah.
Right? Because at home, home is structured, but you're not making kids sit down.
Yeah.
Right? But at school, there are very different expectations. And
Yeah.
if they can't control their body or their emotions well enough to sit and engage in class, then that could be a problem, right?
Okay.
And they might need extra supports, which is when we come in and do the evaluation to see like where are they at, is this affecting their academics, and what accommodations do they need?
Okay.
So the other type of ADHD is the inattentive type. Right. And these are kids that you don't tend to see earlier on because it's not as like visible.
Yeah.
Right. So these are kids that might zone out
Okay.
or not pay attention. They're easily distracted. Sometimes they're disorganized or they can't follow directions because they'll start to do one thing and then they'll see something else and then their attention goes that way.
Sure.
Right. These are also kids where you tend to see it the most is when you want to sit down for homework. And they don't want to do the homework because it's not fun. It's not exciting, right? They'd rather like play video games or go do something active.
Sure.
Right? So you'll see them avoid.
Okay.
Right?
So
or
these are the kids that need a snack or I have to go to the bathroom or I need a drink of water or what, that's the kind of, avoidance that we're talking about.
Exactly.
Right? Okay.
Right. So if that's happening consistently at times when they find something either like boring, like cleaning up, right, doing homework, or something that's difficult for them, then yes, that could be a sign of ADHD. Alternatively, there's the hyperfocusing as well, where they're, overly engaged in something, to the point where it's hard to pull them away.
Sure.
And a lot of times that tends to be video games or screens.
Sure.
Right? It's hard to pull them away and you might see like meltdowns and things like that.
Okay.
So ADHD, it's not so much that kids can't focus, but it's that they can't regulate their attention to do what they need to do.
Sure. So it could be just I'm too focused on something. I'm way too into this or that sort of thing. Okay.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So talk to me really quickly about the twice exceptional kid. What does that mean and what is included in a twice exceptional diagnosis?
Yeah, so technically speaking, we're looking at an IQ profile, right? And it's generally, there are different regulations around this, but it's generally an IQ score of 125 or higher. And we're talking about like a full scale IQ, which is like the overall IQ. Or you can use what's called like on the WISC, we use a lot, it's the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. We use the General Ability Index because sometimes kids that are twice exceptional, they have really exceptional verbal and nonverbal skills, but their memory and their processing speed are slower, right? And that usually indicates like an underlying learning disability or attention challenge.
Sure.
So we can, depending on like the nuances in their scores, we can use that type of index. But either way, you're looking at an overall score of a 125 or like the 95th percentile. So we're talking about the top 5% of kids intellectually, right? Mm-hmm. So that constitutes a gifted child. Now, if they also have some sort of like disability or challenge that impacts their learning in some way, then they can be considered twice exceptional, right? So that could be anything, right? It's pretty broad, from things like anxiety or depression to ADHD, learning disability, motor concerns, et cetera. But just something that impacts their learning, meaning that you need to give them challenging work, right? To motivate them and to like really enhance their advanced learning, but also you need to give them support in the areas of need.
So this could be the kid that is very dyslexic, but also very smart, or very twice exceptional then, right? Because they would be having the learning disability would be dyslexia, but then their IQ would be really high, or something along those lines would make the twice. You'd have to have both things to make twice exceptional.
Yes,
correct?
You have to be gifted and also have something else. And again, it's not just learning disabilities, but something that impacts their learning in some way. Yeah.